Two British scientists are finally revealing the DNA evidence they say helped solve one of history's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
Scientists' shocking new discovery about Jack the Ripper changes everything. For centuries, the identity of one of the most popular serial killers in modern times, Jack the Ripper, has puzzled researchers. However, that has only made interest in the crime spree soar, but now a shocking new discovery could prove to be the missing item in the puzzle. What have researchers discovered about this famous criminal, and how does it nail the identity of the killer? If you want to find out, stay glued to us as we dive into the details of scientists' new shocking discovery about Jack the Ripper that changes everything.
I think the fact that there are two signatures which appear to match signatures from descendants increases the confidence that what we're looking at is something which is real.
There's a set of people that seemingly derive pleasure from killing humans. To derive this macabre satisfaction, they use various weapons, including knives. By far the most popular and mysterious to ever kill with a knife is the enigma known as Jack the Ripper, who terrorized the inhabitants of London. The influence of Jack the Ripper remains today, as criminal profiling was born because of him, making him the first criminal in history to be profiled. Dr. Thomas Bond not only expressed his judgment on the killer's anatomical knowledge, but also detailed the killer's motives. He described the killer's urges as periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, hinting that the atrocities were sexual in nature. According to one study, leaving the victims on display in sexually degrading positions with the wounds exposed is evidence that the killer gained sexual enjoyment from his actions. If this is accurate, modern-day criminal profilers would most likely define Jack the Ripper as a sexual predator with extreme sadistic tendencies. In 1888, a sequence of murders in London's Whitechapel neighborhood became famous as the Jack the Ripper murders. These murders made an inedible mark on public consciousness, and people are still intrigued by the identity and reasons of the elusive killer more than a century later. In this article, we'll look at how Jack the Ripper terrorized London by looking at the events leading up to the killings, the details of the crimes, and the case's aftermath and legacy. The events leading up to the murders in London were marked by unrest and social instability. London's East End was a densely populated district with a sizable working-class population. Unemployment, poverty, and overcrowding were widespread, and the neighborhood was notorious for its high crime rate. Prostitution was prevalent, with an estimated 1,200 prostitutes operating in the Whitechapel district alone. Many of these ladies were impoverished and turned to prostitution for a living. The East End was also a hotspot of political agitation in the late 19th century. Socialists, anarchists, and other radical groups were active in the area, and protests and demonstrations were common. The police force was overworked and frequently inefficient, resulting in a perception of lawlessness and disarray. The murders began in August 1888 against the backdrop of social turmoil and crime. Mary Ann Nichols, the first victim, was discovered dead in the early hours of August 31st. Her throat had been slit and her abdomen mutilated, and she had been cruelly murdered. Her uterus had also been taken by the assailant. Mary Ann Nichols, widely regarded as the first of Jack the Ripper's victims, was a native of London who had spent much of the 1880s on the run. Her marriage to a man named William Nichols appeared to have failed after the birth of their sixth child. William's mind had been irreparably turned by a neighbor named Rosetta, and Mary Ann was building the groundwork for an insurmountable alcohol addiction. She went on a depressing tour of the capital's workhouses and infirmaries. She submitted to the elements, sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square, and finally, when she had blown her last chance at rehabilitation, she drifted to the East End, as so many unanchored people do. Her last option was prostitution. By August 31st, 1888, she was homeless and without the funds to pay for a bed in a lodging house. She claimed to have earned and then drunk away the 4-pence fee numerous times that day. At 2:30 a.m., an acquaintance saw her in the darkness, inebriated and wobbling, at the intersection of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. Mary Ann would be seen alive for the last time by anyone other than her murderer. At 3:45 a.m., two men going west along Bucks Row noticed what they assumed was an abandoned tarpaulin on the footpath. A closer look revealed that it was the body of a woman. Her throat slit and her blood pooled. The horrific wounds in Mary Ann's abdomen were discovered only after her body was undressed in the crude village mortuary. Another of Jack the Ripper's victims was Annie Chapman. One could say Annie Chapman's situation was the direct opposite of Mary Ann's. She had spent part of her adolescence and later part of her married life in Windsor in the shadow of the royal castle, far from the rookeries of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Annie and her husband, John, even had their photograph taken around 1869. The image, discovered in 2001 by researcher Neil Stubbing Sheldon, is the only one we have of any of Jack the Ripper's canonical victims in life. A photograph was not a typical working-class accessory. Plainly, the Chapmans were heading for better things, or at the very least, minor comforts along the road. Annie, on the other hand, quickly became distant from her family and increasingly intimate with alcohol as the 1800s progressed. By 1888, she had become lonely, emaciated, and afflicted with chronic ailments. She was also seen brawling with another woman, Eliza Cooper, on September 5, 1888, over a disputed bit of soap. Annie's face was scarred from the struggle. Perhaps this was an indication that her ability to protect herself was fading. Then, on September 8th, in the early hours of the morning, Annie's body was discovered in the unguarded yard behind 29th Hanbury Street with no trace of the perpetrator. If you were in Aldgate High Street at 8:30 on September 29, 1888, you would have seen P.C. Lewis Robinson staring down at a figure in the darkness lying at his feet. A crowd had gathered, but no one knew who she was. He picked her up and leaned her against the shop shutters. She slid sideways drunkenly. The woman, Catherine Eddowes, was slightly recovered from her binge after a few hours in the cells at Bishopsgate Police Station and was ready to be released. She had avoided telling the police her real name. She took the duty officer's moralisms in stride. She also pushed the door to the police station shut, and she went left away from Whitechapel. It was 1 o'clock in the morning on September 30th, 1888. Dutfield's yard, a short distance to the east, had become crowded. Catherine would be discovered dead in 45 minutes. Her injuries were evidence of someone's violence, but there was no trace of the attacker. Of all the Ripper's victims, Mary Jane Kelly is the most enigmatic. Her death propelled her to public attention, but her past remains obscure and largely out of reach. She presented a rich narrative, full of adventure and misery, after falling into a romance with a fish market porter named Joseph Barnett. Some portions of her self-described past appear to be correct, but a thorough and verifiable summary of her background remains elusive to researchers. The last terrible memory of Jack the Ripper's murderous fugue is a photograph of Mary Jane's body on her bed, stripped of almost everything that made her human. In a departure from his usual practices, the Ripper went inside to kill, seemingly sure that he would not be interrupted that night. Barnett had really moved out of the dismal Miller's Court room he had lived with Mary Jane a few weeks earlier, offended by her return to regular prostitution and abandoning her. Elizabeth Prater, who lived upstairs, heard a murder yell at 4 a.m. on November 9, 1888, but did nothing about it. Mary Jane's lifeless body was discovered just before 11 o'clock. The name Jack the Ripper originated from a letter that was sent to the Central News Agency in London on September 27, 1888, claiming to be the murderer of several prostitutes in Whitechapel. The letter was signed Jack the Ripper and addressed to Dear Boss. The letter also proposed cutting off the next victim's ears and handing them over to the authorities. The letter was widely publicized in the press and drew a lot of attention. Many experts claimed the letter was a fake, authored by a journalist or someone else looking to create a stir and boost newspaper sales. However, the moniker Jack the Ripper remained and became synonymous with the enigmatic and ruthless assassin. The details of the murders were brutal and upsetting to the general audience. All of the victims were attacked from behind, their throats slashed, and their corpses mangled. The killer appeared to be well versed in human anatomy, as some of the victims had organs removed from them. The murders received widespread media coverage, and the public was both fascinated and horrified by the facts. A lot of issues hampered the police investigation into the murders. Onlookers frequently contaminated crime scenes, and forensic techniques were not yet advanced enough to offer usable evidence. The murderer left few clues, and the few witnesses who came forward were frequently untrustworthy. Over the years, there have been many theories and potential suspects. One of them is the Royal Ripper. According to this hypothesis, Jack the Ripper was Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, who got syphilis from a prostitute and sought vengeance in a fit of craziness. According to certain versions of this theory, his physician, Sir William Gull, was an accomplice or the mastermind behind the killings. There's also the Medical Ripper, According to this belief, Jack the Ripper had medical knowledge or training, as indicated by his surgical abilities and anatomical knowledge. Some of the suspects in this category include Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, and abortionist Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a Scottish-Canadian serial killer and poisoner, and Dr. William Henry Bury, a Scottish merchant and wife murderer. Then there is the Outcast Ripper, which proposes the perpetrator is one of London's East End's downtrodden immigrants or ethnic minorities. Michael Ostrog, a Russian robber and con artist, and Jacob Levy, a Spitalfields butcher and syphilitic sufferer, are among the suspects in this category. Some researchers even propose the existence of a female Ripper. According to this belief, Jack the Ripper was a woman, possibly a midwife, nurse, or prostitute. Mary Piercy, a childminder and killer, Lizzie Williams, the wife of a surgeon and supposed lover of Prince Albert Victor, and Mary Jane Kelly, one of the Ripper's victims who faked her own death, are among the prospects for this theory. You also have the Assassin Ripper, which the proponents claim Jack the Ripper was a member of the Assassin Order, a secret order of assassins that fought the Templars for centuries. According to this idea, Jack was sent to Whitechapel to murder certain targets, but he turned rogue and began killing innocent people as well. Some variations of this hypothesis also connect Jack to historical personalities including Queen Victoria, Charles Darwin, and Winston Churchill.
Polish Jewish immigrants that came over to London in 1881. His name is Aaron Kosminski. He lived with his family just literally not far from the murders. And shortly after the final murder, he got put into Colney Hatch Asylum, like a lunatic asylum. He stayed there for a few years and then got moved to Leavesden Asylum and died there in 1919. When I bought the shawl, I had no reason to disbelieve that it was Catherine Eddowes' shawl. But the significance of the pattern on the shawl, Michaelmas Daisies, of course Michaelmas is celebrated, in fact it was 2 days ago on the 29th of September and the 8th of November. And lo and behold, 2 murders happened on the early hours of the 30th, so the night of the 29th, if you like. And on the 8th of November, the night, he went and murdered his final victim, and she was found in the early hours of the 9th of November.
Forensic scientists, however, have put up a new suspect, and they've backed their theory with DNA evidence. DNA is a powerful crime-solving tool because it can be used to identify individuals on the basis of their unique genetic makeup. Except for identical twins, DNA is found in every cell of the human body and differs from person to person. This means that DNA can be used to connect a suspect to a crime scene or to rule someone out of suspicion. DNA can also be used to identify crime victims, such as human remains or missing individuals. By matching DNA from historical evidence to DNA databases that preserve profiles of convicted offenders or relatives of missing persons, DNA can also aid in solving cold cases. On the other hand, by demonstrating that their DNA does not match the evidence, DNA can also assist in exonerating innocent people who've been wrongfully convicted of crimes. Genetic tests published this week point to Aaron Kosminski, a 23-year-old Polish barber and a prime police suspect at the time. The findings stem from a forensic investigation of a soiled silk shawl discovered close to the mangled remains of Catherine Eddowes, the 4th victim in 1888. The shawl is splattered with blood and semen, the latter of which is thought to be from the killer. Kosminski was born in 1865. While the specific location is unknown, he was most likely born in Russia. He migrated to England with his sisters and their families in 1882. His mother does not appear to have moved with her family at this time, and there's no evidence that his father ever arrived in England. He was a hairdresser, though he hadn't worked in years. On July 12, 1890, he was admitted to the Mile End Town Workhouse Infirmary from his brother Wolf's home at 3 Scion Square, Commercial Road East. He had been insane for 2 years, it was discovered. 3 days later, he was released into the care of his brother, whose address is listed as 16 Greenfield Street, the address of his brother-in-law Morris Lubnowski. He was readmitted from 16 Greenfield Street on February 4, 1891, and committed 3 days later to Colney Hatch Mental Asylum, where he remained until April 13, 1894, when he was transferred to Leavesden Institute for Imbeciles. Leavesden Asylum started in 1870 and housed 1,600 patients in May 1871. He remained there until his death on March 24, 1919, at the age of 54, the cause of death being gangrene of the left leg. On March 27th, he was buried at East Ham Cemetery. His address was stated as 5 Ashcroft Road, Bow, the house of Morris Lubnowski and his family. When Kosminski was admitted to Colney Hatch, it was stated that he travels about the streets and picks up crumbs of bread from the gutter and eats them, drinks water from a sandpipe, and refuses food at the hands of others. He's very unclean and will not be washed. Dr. Hushin, who examined Kosminski when he was readmitted to the Mile End Infirmary, stated that the patient felt he was guided and controlled by an instinct that informed his intellect, that he claimed to know the actions of all humans, and that he obsessively self-abused himself. This is not the first time Kosminski has been implicated in a crime. However, the supporting DNA evidence is being published in a peer-reviewed journal for the first time. Jari Llewellyn, a biochemist at Liverpool John Moores University in the United Kingdom, conducted the first genetic testing on Shaw samples several years ago, but he said he wanted to wait for the hubbub to quiet down before submitting the results. In his 2014 book, Naming Jack the Ripper, author Russell Edwards, who purchased the shawl in 2007 and donated it to Llewellyn, utilized the unpublished results of the test to identify Kosminski as the murderer. However, geneticists argued at the time that assessing the claims was hard due to a lack of technical specifics concerning the study of DNA samples from the shawl. In what Llewellyn and his colleague David Miller, a reproduction and sperm expert at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, call the most systematic and advanced genetic analysis to date regarding the Jack the Ripper murders.
We did the research with all the top places in England, Sotheby's, the V&A, Christie's, Huguenot Society, Silk's specialist in Switzerland. We cracked it and got the significant date to make sure it was around at the time of the murders. And then we had an amazing scientist named Dr. Fayez Ismail that did perform mass spectrometry on the shawl and said, look, this dye comes from St. Petersburg, which is northern Russia.
They described extracting and amplifying DNA from the shawl. The tests compared mitochondrial DNA fragments, the fraction of DNA inherited only from one's mother, extracted from the shawl, to samples collected from Idau's and Kosminski's surviving relatives. They determined that the DNA matches that of a living cousin of Kosminski. The research also indicates that the killer had brown hair and brown eyes, which is consistent with eyewitness testimony. It must be noted that these characteristics were almost certainly not unique. Blue eyes are now more common than brown eyes in England. The outcomes are unlikely to please detractors. The research lacks key details on the precise genetic variations detected and compared between DNA samples. Instead, the authors use a visual with a sequence of colored boxes to depict them. They claim that where the boxes overlap, the shawl and current DNA sequences match. The scientists claim in their study that the Data Protection Act, a UK regulation designed to safeguard individuals' privacy, prevents them from disclosing the genetic sequences of Idau's and Kosminski's living relatives. They claim that the paper's visual is easier to understand for non-scientists, particularly those interested in true crime. However, according to Walter Parson, a forensic scientist at Innsbruck Medical University's Institute of Legal Medicine, mitochondrial DNA sequences pose no risk to privacy and should have been published in the publication. Otherwise, the reader will be unable to judge the outcome. I'm curious where science and research will go if we stop revealing outcomes and instead present colored boxes. The name Ripper has been applied to other murderers. There is, for instance, the Yorkshire Ripper, the nickname of Peter Sutcliffe, an English serial killer who murdered 13 women and attempted to murder 7 more between 1975 and 1980. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 1981. He died of COVID-19 in 2020. Sutcliffe mostly targeted prostitutes in Yorkshire and Manchester, killing them with a hammer and a knife. He claimed to be on a divine mission to rid the world of prostitutes. Despite being examined 9 times by police during their investigation, he eluded detection until he was detained in Sheffield for driving with fraudulent license plates. His case was one of the most renowned and costly manhunts in British history, resulting in improvements to police operations.